Lila Hargrove should not know his name. Yet in Chicago's rain-soaked darkness, the homeless man became her only certainty. Jonah Reed, invisible to a city that perfected forgetting, carried the crying girl toward her father's mirrored tower, toward Adrian Hargrove's empire of glass and controlled light. Security descended. The child's arms tightened. "Grandpa," she whispered. The word, a detonation. Adrian's face went white. The estrangement was complete, buried, final. Until it wasn't. Subscribe to witness 3 lives split open by one impossible recognition. The rain fell in Chicago like judgment, cold and relentless, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected nothing but the city's indifference. Jonah Reed sat beneath the overpass on West Adams, his back pressed against concrete that held the chill of 1,000 forgotten nights. His military jacket, 40 years old and threadbare, pulled tight around shoulders that had once carried the weight of other men's lives. The cardboard beneath him was disintegrating, surrendering to the weather with the same resignation he'd learned to wear like a second skin. And the traffic above created a rhythm that had become his only companion, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped, never acknowledged, never cared. His hands were wrapped in strips of fabric he'd found near a dumpster behind a restaurant where he sometimes waited for scraps, and his beard, grey, streaked with white, wild with neglect, caught droplets that ran down into the collar of his jacket. Each one a small invasion of the cold he could never quite escape. He'd stopped counting the nights years ago, stopped marking time in any way that suggested tomorrow might be different from today, and the city moved around him like he was already a ghost, already erased from the narrative that mattered to the people in their warm cars and their bright windows high above the streets where men like him dissolved into the scenery. The sound cut through the rain's monotone. A child's cry, high and sharp with terror, the kind of sound that pierced even the armor of exhaustion Jonah had built around himself. He lifted his head, blinking water from his eyes, and saw her, a small figure stumbling along the sidewalk across the street, maybe 30 yards away, her pink jacket vivid against the grey evening, her movements erratic with panic. She couldn't have been more than 6 or 7, her dark hair plastered to her face by the downpour, and she was calling out words Jonah couldn't make out over the noise of the city, her voice breaking with the kind of desperation that spoke of absolute aloneness. Something in his chest, something he'd thought had died somewhere between Kandahar and the VA hospital that had processed him like damaged cargo, shifted and woke. He pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting, his body a catalogue of old injuries and newer hungers. And he stepped out from under the overpass into the full force of the rain. The cold hit him like a physical blow, soaking through his jacket in seconds, but he moved toward the child anyway, his feet remembering how to hurry even as his mind tried to calculate the risk of drawing attention, of being seen, of mattering in a way that might bring consequences he couldn't afford. She saw him approaching and froze, her eyes wide and dark and filled with a fear that made Jonah's heart twist in ways he'd forgotten were possible. He stopped several feet away, raising his hands in a gesture meant to communicate safety, though he knew how he must look to her. This wild-haired stranger emerging from the rain, this man the city had marked as other, as threat, as someone children were taught to avoid. "It's okay," he said, his voice rougher than he remembered it being, scraped raw by years of disuse and cold nights and conversations that existed only in his head. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" The girl stared at him, her whole body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps that spoke of crying that had gone on too long. And for a moment, Jonah thought she would run, would disappear into the maze of streets and become another tragedy the city would absorb without comment. But then she nodded, a small jerky movement, and the fear in her eyes shifted into something even more heartbreaking, hope fragile and desperate, the kind of hope that had no business existing in a moment like this. "I can't find my daddy," she said, her voice so small it was almost lost in the rain, and Jonah felt something in him break cleanly, a fracture he'd been holding together through sheer force of will for longer than he could remember. He moved closer, slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening, and when he was near enough he crouched down, so his face was level with hers. Ignoring the water pooling around his knees, ignoring the stares of a woman passing with an umbrella who pulled her own child closer and quickened her pace. "What's your name?" he asked, and the girl hesitated, some instinct warring with her need, before she answered, "Lila Hargrove." The name meant nothing to Jonah, just another collection of sounds in a city full of names he didn't know. But he nodded as if it mattered, as if knowing it gave him some power to fix what was broken. "Lila, that's a beautiful name. I'm Jonah. Do you know where your daddy is? Do you know where you live?" She shook her head, tears mixing with rain on her face, and her lower lip trembled in a way that made her look impossibly young, impossibly vulnerable. "I was with Miss Sarah, but then I saw something. A puppy, I think, and I ran after it, and when I turned around everyone was gone, and I didn't know which way, and I walked and walked, but everything looks the same, and I'm so cold, and I want my daddy." The words tumbled out in a rush, each one edged with panic, and Jonah reached out instinctively to put a hand on her shoulder, then stopped himself, remembering the rules, the invisible boundaries that separated people like him from people like her. But Lila didn't wait for permission. She closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder, and Jonah felt the shock of it run through his entire body like electricity. No one had touched him with anything approaching affection in more years than he could count, and the sensation of her small body pressed against his, trusting and desperate, and completely unaware of the social mathematics that said this shouldn't happen, unmade something in him. He brought his arms up, slowly, carefully, and held her, feeling her shake with cold and fear, feeling her heartbeat flutter against his chest like a trapped bird. "It's okay," he murmured, the words automatic, the words every adult learns to say to frightened children, even when nothing is okay, even when the world is precisely as cruel and indifferent as it seems. "We're going to find your daddy, I promise." And even as he said it, even as he felt the weight of that promise settle onto shoulders already carrying too much, he wondered if he still had the right to make promises to anyone. If a man who'd failed everyone who'd ever depended on him could be trusted with something as precious as a lost child's hope. But Lila pulled back just enough to look at him, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in forever, and she nodded, believing him completely, and Jonah knew he would do whatever it took to keep that belief intact. He stood, his knees protesting, and Lila immediately reached for his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his with a grip that spoke of absolute trust, and they began to walk. Jonah's mind raced through options: police station, fire station, anywhere with authority and warmth and the resources to handle a situation like this properly. But Lila was talking, her voice steadier now that she wasn't alone, telling him about her daddy, who worked in the tall building with all the glass, about how she lived on the 42nd floor, where you could see the whole city spread out like a map made of lights. "The Hargrove building," she said with a child's pride, and Jonah felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. Adrian Hargrove. The name triggered fragments of memory, news articles glimpsed through coffee shop windows, a face on a billboard advertising some tech company, the kind of success story Chicago loved to tell itself about vision and innovation and the new economy. A CEO, untouchable wealth, the kind of person who lived in a different universe than the one Jonah inhabited, as distant as stars. And this child, this small hand in his, belonged to that world, to that man, to a life so far removed from standing under overpasses that they might as well exist in different centuries. The rain continued to fall as they walked, Jonah adjusting his pace to match Lila's shorter steps, and the city's lights began to bloom around them as evening deepened into night. Each window a small reminder of all the warmth and safety and belonging that existed just out of reach, forever on the other side of glass he would never be invited to cross. The Hargrove building rose from Michigan Avenue like an accusation, 60 stories of mirrored glass that reflected the city back at itself with clinical precision, a monument to the kind of wealth that no longer needed to announce itself, because it had already won every argument that mattered. Jonah stood on the sidewalk with Lila's hand still in his, staring up at the building's facade where clouds moved across the surface like thoughts across the face of something too vast to comprehend, and he felt the old familiar shame rise in his throat, bitter and familiar. This was a mistake. He should have taken her to a police station, should have handed her off to someone in a uniform, someone official, someone whose presence wouldn't create the kind of scene he could already feel building in the air like electricity before a storm. But Lila had been so certain, so insistent that her daddy was here, in this building, on the 42nd floor. And Jonah had been too tired and too cold and too caught in the momentum of the child's need to think clearly about what it would mean to walk through those doors. The entrance was all polished brass and revolving glass, the kind of threshold designed to sort people, to announce who belonged and who didn't, and Jonah could see his reflection in the surface, wild-haired, soaked, his clothes marking him as clearly as any scarlet letter, and he knew exactly what he looked like to the world behind that glass. Lila tugged on his hand, impatient with his hesitation. Her earlier fear transformed into eager anticipation, now that she was close to safety, close to her father, close to the world she recognized. "Come on," she said, pulling him forward. And Jonah followed because he'd already committed to this path, and because turning back now would mean abandoning her at the moment when she needed him to be steady, to be the adult who didn't flinch. They pushed through the revolving door into a lobby that felt less like a room and more like a declaration of dominance, marble floors that gleamed like ice, chandeliers that threw light in calculated patterns, a reception desk that stretched the length of a city block, everything designed to make visitors feel small, to establish the hierarchy before a single word was spoken. The warmth hit Jonah like a wall, the contrast with the rain outside so extreme it made his skin prickle, and he became hyper-aware of the water dripping from his clothes onto the pristine floor, of the smell he carried with him, unwashed clothes and old sweat, and the particular mustiness that clung to people who slept outside. 2 security guards at the desk looked up immediately, their postures shifting from bored attention to alert suspicion in the space of a heartbeat, and Jonah saw the calculation happen in their eyes. Threat assessment, category assignment, the kind of snap judgment he'd been subject to for so long it no longer even registered as offensive, just inevitable. The taller guard, a man in his 30s with the build of someone who spent serious time in a gym, moved out from behind the desk with the deliberate casualness of someone trained to handle problems without creating panic. "Sir, I'm going to need you to stop right there," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and courtesy that was really just one thin layer over an order. Jonah stopped, feeling Lila's hand tighten in his, feeling the lobby's attention focus on them like a spotlight, and he tried to find words that would make this make sense, that would bridge the gap between what this looked like and what it actually was. "I found her," he said, gesturing to Lila. "Outside, in the rain. She was lost. She says her father works here, Adrian Hargrove." He watched the name land, watched both guards' expressions shift from suspicious to alarmed, and the taller one immediately reached for his radio, speaking in urgent low tones, while the second guard, younger with nervous eyes, positioned himself between Jonah and the elevators as if Jonah might make a run for them. "Lila Hargrove," the taller guard said, his focus shifting to the child, his voice gentling in that way adults' voices did when addressing children who belonged to important people. "Mr. Hargrove's daughter?" Lila nodded, suddenly shy now that she was surrounded by authority, and she pressed closer to Jonah's leg, and Jonah felt the insanity of the moment. This child, who should have been relieved to be surrounded by protection, by people whose job was literally to keep her safe, was instead clinging to him, to the homeless man who'd pulled her from the rain. Within seconds, the lobby transformed into controlled chaos. 2 more security guards appeared from somewhere, then a woman in an expensive suit who introduced herself as building management, her eyes flicking over Jonah with barely concealed distaste, even as her mouth shaped itself around words like "thank you" and "grateful" that didn't match the calculation happening behind her professionally pleasant expression. Someone brought a blanket for Lila, tried to coax her away from Jonah, but she resisted, her grip on his hand becoming almost painful in its intensity. "I want to stay with Grandpa," she said, and the word dropped into the lobby like a bomb, and everything stopped. Jonah felt the world tilt, felt his heart do something complicated and painful in his chest, because that word, Grandpa, was impossible, was absurd, was a mistake born of a child's confusion and trauma. He'd never met this girl before an hour ago, had no connection to her beyond finding her crying in the rain, and yet she'd said it with such certainty, such absolute conviction, that for a moment even he wondered if there was some truth he'd forgotten, some relationship his broken memory had misplaced. The woman in the suit looked from Lila to Jonah with an expression that had moved past distaste into something approaching alarm, and the tall security guard's hand moved to his belt, to the weapon Jonah could see holstered there, and the temperature in the lobby seemed to drop despite the expensive heating system. "Sweetie, this isn't your grandfather," the suited woman said, her voice still gentle, but with an edge of firmness that suggested she was used to managing situations that required delicate handling. "Your grandfather doesn't live in Chicago. You're confused, honey. It's okay. You've had a scary time." But Lila shook her head stubbornly, her jaw setting in a way that suggested Adrian Hargrove's genes had given her more than just his last name, and she looked up at Jonah with such complete faith that he felt something in his chest crack open. "He found me," she said. "He kept me safe. He's Grandpa." And Jonah wanted to correct her, wanted to explain that whatever she'd constructed in her frightened mind was a fantasy, a coping mechanism, something that would dissolve once she was back in her father's arms and the world made sense again. But the words stuck in his throat because some part of him, some treacherous, half-dead part he'd thought he'd successfully buried, wanted to believe her, wanted to live in the story where he was someone's grandfather, someone's family, someone who mattered beyond being a problem to be managed or a cautionary tale to be avoided. The elevator chimed, the sound crystalline and definitive, and Jonah knew without being told that everything was about to change, that whoever emerged from those polished doors would reshape the entire geometry of this moment, and he braced himself in the way he'd learned to brace for incoming fire, knowing that preparation didn't actually protect you from the impact, but it gave you something to do in the seconds before everything exploded. The doors opened, and Adrian Hargrove stepped into the lobby, and Jonah felt recognition slam into him like a physical force. Not recognition of the man himself. Jonah had never seen him before, knew him only as an abstraction, a category, the kind of success that existed in newspapers and earnings reports and corner offices so high above street level they might as well be in orbit. But recognition of the type, of the bearing, of the particular way wealth and power shaped a person's body language into something between confidence and contempt. Adrian was tall, lean in the way that suggested personal trainers and careful nutrition rather than hunger, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Jonah had earned in the last decade of his life, and his face, sharp-featured, intelligent, currently frozen in an expression of barely controlled terror, bore the kind of handsomeness that looked like it had been designed by committee. He scanned the lobby, his eyes moving past Jonah as if he were furniture, locking onto Lila, and the transformation was immediate. The CEO mask cracked, and something raw and desperate showed through. "Lila," he said, and his voice broke on her name. And he was moving before anyone could stop him, crossing the marble floor in long strides, and Lila finally released Jonah's hand and ran to meet him, and father and daughter collided in an embrace that made everyone in the lobby look away, made even the security guards soften their stances, because there were some things that transcended category and class and all the careful sorting the world insisted on. A father's terror at his child's disappearance, a child's relief at being found. Adrian Hargrove held his daughter like she might dissolve if he loosened his grip, his face buried in her wet hair, his shoulders shaking with the kind of relief that bordered on collapse. And for a long moment, the lobby existed in suspended animation, everyone present locked in the orbit of that reunion. Jonah stood where Lila had left him, his hand still half raised from where she'd pulled free, feeling the absence of her touch like a wound, and he knew he should leave now, should slip out while everyone's attention was focused on the father and daughter, should return to the rain and the overpass and the life that waited for him like a patient predator. But his feet wouldn't move, held in place by something he couldn't name. Exhaustion, maybe, or curiosity, or the simple human desire to see the story through to its ending. Adrian pulled back from Lila, just far enough to examine her face, his hands moving over her shoulders, her arms, checking for injuries with the frantic precision of someone who'd spent the last hours imagining every worst-case scenario. "Are you hurt? Did anyone hurt you? God, Lila, where were you? We've been looking everywhere. The police are out, I thought." His voice broke again, couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't name the fear that had clearly been consuming him, and Lila reached up to touch his face with her small hand, a gesture of comfort that reversed the natural order of parent and child. "I'm okay, Daddy," she said, her voice steady in a way that suggested she hadn't fully processed the danger she'd been in, the way children often didn't understand the weight of disaster until long after they were safe. "I got lost, but Grandpa found me. He brought me home." And there it was again, that word, dropped into the moment with innocent certainty, and Jonah watched Adrian's face change, watched the relief freeze into something harder, watched his eyes, grey and sharp, and used to seeing through corporate presentations and market projections, finally focus on Jonah with the kind of attention that felt like being placed under a microscope. The CEO straightened, pulling Lila with him, positioning himself between his daughter and the homeless man in a movement so instinctive it was almost reflexive, and Jonah could see the assessment happening, taking in the ragged clothes, the wild beard, the way water was still pooling around Jonah's worn boots on the pristine marble. "Who are you?" Adrian said, and his voice had lost all the warmth it had held moments before, had become cold and controlled and carrying an edge that reminded Jonah of officers he'd known in the service, men who could make a question sound like an accusation. Jonah cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd been required to explain himself to anyone, since his existence had mattered enough to warrant explanation. "Jonah Reed," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended, scraped raw by the cold and by something else he couldn't quite identify. "I found her on West Adams, about a mile from here. She was crying alone. She told me her name, said her father worked here. I just wanted to make sure she got home safe." The words felt inadequate, felt like they couldn't possibly convey the complexity of the last hour, the weight of the small hand in his, the way Lila's trust had felt like both a gift and a responsibility he wasn't sure he'd earned. Adrian's jaw tightened, and Jonah could see him processing, calculating, trying to determine threat level and intention and whether this stranger deserved gratitude or suspicion. "Thank you," Adrian said finally, the words clearly costing him something, emerging with the stiffness of an obligation fulfilled rather than genuine feeling. "I appreciate you bringing her back. We'll make sure you're compensated for your time." He reached into his jacket, pulled out a wallet that probably held more cash than Jonah saw in a month, and the gesture, so casual, so automatic, made something in Jonah's stomach turn to ice. "I don't want money," Jonah said, and he heard the edge in his own voice, heard the old pride that hadn't quite died despite years of learning to swallow it, despite accepting charity and handouts and the small degradations that came with needing help you couldn't repay. "I didn't bring her back for a reward. I brought her back because she needed help." Adrian's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe, or confusion, the look of someone encountering behavior that didn't fit the expected script, and he put the wallet away slowly, deliberately, as if unsure what else to do with his hands. The lobby had become an audience, security guards and the suited woman and a few office workers who'd emerged from elevators or emerged from back rooms, all of them watching this exchange with the particular fascination people had for moments when different worlds collided. When the careful segregation of the city's populations broke down and the people who weren't supposed to meet were suddenly forced to occupy the same space. Lila twisted in her father's arms, looking back at Jonah with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than a 6-year-old should be able to see, and she reached out toward him, her small hand opening and closing in a gesture that was part wave and part summons. "Why did you call him Grandpa?" Adrian asked, and his voice had softened now, had become gentle again. But there was something underneath the gentleness, a wariness, a confusion, maybe even a hint of fear. Lila looked up at her father with complete seriousness, with the kind of certainty that children had before the world taught them to doubt their own perceptions. "Because he is," she said simply, as if it were obvious, as if the truth of it was written in languages only she could read. "He has Grandpa's eyes. You showed me the picture, remember? The one in your desk drawer, the one you think I don't know about." And Jonah watched Adrian Hargrove's face drain of color, watched the CEO's careful control fracture into something approaching shock. And even before Adrian turned to look at him again, really look at him this time, not past him, but into him, Jonah felt the first whisper of recognition, the first tremor of impossible possibility. Their eyes met across the marble floor, across the gulf of circumstance and choice and years that had passed like lifetimes, and Jonah saw Adrian's face shift through a rapid sequence of emotions. Disbelief, confusion, recognition, horror, rage, and something else he couldn't quite name, something that looked almost like grief. "Dad," Adrian said, and the word came out strangled. Came out like something that had to fight its way past every defense he'd ever built, and Jonah felt the floor drop out from under him, felt 30 years of carefully maintained distance and deliberate forgetting collapse into dust. He opened his mouth to deny it, to explain that this was impossible, that Adrian Hargrove, the CEO, couldn't be the same person as the boy he'd left behind, the son who'd been 15 when Jonah had walked out the door and never looked back, who'd been part of a life Jonah had dismantled so thoroughly he'd almost convinced himself it had never existed. But the denial wouldn't come, couldn't form itself into words, because now that Adrian had said it, now that the possibility had been named, Jonah could see it, could see the ghost of the boy in this man's face, could see the eyes that were the same grey as his own, could see the way Adrian held himself with the particular rigid control of someone who'd learned early not to need anyone, not to trust that people would stay. "I thought you were dead," Adrian said, and his voice was flat now, emotionless. The kind of tone people used when they were trying very hard not to feel anything at all. "The VA told me you were dead 6 years ago. They sent me a letter." The lobby had become a theater, every person present locked into the unfolding drama with the particular stillness that came from witnessing something they knew they shouldn't be seeing, something too raw and private to be happening in a space designed for commerce and efficiency. Jonah felt his legs threaten to give out, felt the weight of 30 years settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing, and he wanted to run, wanted to dissolve into the rain outside and disappear the way he'd become so good at disappearing, the way he'd been disappearing from his own life for longer than he could remember. But Lila was looking at him with such trust, with such innocent certainty, that he was exactly who she'd named him to be, and Adrian was staring at him with an expression that combined horror and fury, and something that might have been hope if hope hadn't been beaten out of it by too much disappointment. And Jonah found himself rooted to the marble floor, unable to do anything but face what he'd spent 3 decades running from. "I'm not dead," Jonah said, and the words felt absurd even as he spoke them, stating the obvious in a situation where nothing else seemed capable of being said. "I don't know why the VA would have told you that. I never meant for you to think." But what had he meant? What had he intended when he'd stopped answering calls, stopped opening letters, stopped acknowledging that he had a son who might need him or want him, or at minimum deserve to know whether his father was alive or dead? Adrian shifted Lila to his hip, holding her with one arm while his other hand clenched and unclenched at his side, the only visible sign of whatever was happening beneath his carefully maintained surface. "You left," he said, and each word was precise, controlled, delivered with the kind of care people used when they were trying very hard not to scream. "You walked out when I was 15 years old. You told Mom you couldn't do it anymore, that the war had broken something in you that couldn't be fixed, that I reminded you of everything you wanted to forget. You packed a bag and you walked out, and that was it. No calls, no letters, nothing." The recitation was clinical, factual, drained of emotion in a way that somehow made it more devastating than if he'd been shouting, and Jonah felt each word land like a blow, felt the truth of it arrange itself into an indictment he had no defense against. The security guards had retreated to a respectful distance, but their attention hadn't wavered, and the suited woman was speaking quietly into her phone, probably alerting someone higher up the chain that a situation was developing that required management. Through the building's glass walls, Jonah could see the city continuing its business, cars passing, people walking, the ordinary machinery of life grinding forward completely oblivious to the small apocalypse happening in this lobby. And the contrast made everything feel surreal, made him wonder if he'd somehow slipped into a dream or a nightmare from which he'd wake up back under the overpass. "I couldn't stay," Jonah said, and he heard his own voice crack, heard the weight of justification and guilt and 3 decades of self-loathing pour into those 3 words. "After I came back from Afghanistan, after what happened there, I wasn't the same person. I couldn't sleep without seeing things, couldn't hold a job, couldn't look at you without feeling like I was failing every single day. Your mother tried, God knows she tried, but I was drowning everyone around me. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me, that she'd be better off, that I was doing you a favor by leaving before I dragged you down any further." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, like lies even though they were true, and he watched Adrian's face harden as he spoke, watched the CEO's mask settle back into place like armor. "That's convenient," Adrian said, and now there was heat in his voice, anger breaking through the control like magma through stone. You get to tell yourself you left for our benefit. You get to make it noble, make it a sacrifice instead of what it actually was, abandonment. Do you have any idea what it did to Mom? She died thinking you'd just stopped caring, that we weren't worth the effort of even a phone call. The news hit Jonah like a physical blow, stealing his breath, and he saw the answer to a question he'd been too afraid to ask for years. "She's dead," he said, and his voice came out barely above a whisper. "When?" Adrian's laugh was bitter, sharp-edged, nothing approaching actual humor. 8 years ago, cancer. I tried to find you, to let you know she was sick, that she was asking for you. I hired investigators, contacted veterans organizations, checked every shelter and VA hospital in the state. Nothing. You disappeared so completely it was like you'd never existed. He paused, his jaw working, his eyes bright with something that might have been tears if he'd allowed himself that weakness. And then 6 years ago the VA sent me a letter saying you'd died, that there'd been some kind of accident, that they were sorry for my loss. So I buried the idea of you, had a service with an empty coffin, told Lila about the grandfather she'd never meet, showed her the one picture I'd kept of you in uniform before everything went wrong. And now you're here, standing in my lobby, looking like—" He gestured at Jonah, at his ragged clothes and wild beard, and everything that marked him as other, as failure, as the kind of person Adrian Hargrove had probably spent his entire adult life trying to distance himself from. Lila had been quiet through this exchange, her eyes moving between the two men with the particular intensity of children trying to understand adult emotions that existed in registers beyond their comprehension. But now she reached up and put her hand on her father's cheek, pulling his attention back to her, and said in a voice that cut through the tension like a knife, "Don't be mad at Grandpa. Daddy. He saved me." The simple statement landed in the space between Adrian and Jonah like a bridge, like a fragile possibility. And Jonah saw something in Adrian's face shift. Not forgiveness, not acceptance, but maybe a momentary suspension of the anger. A recognition that whatever history existed between them, whatever wounds and betrayals and years of silence, there was also this, the undeniable fact that the man Adrian had every right to hate had just returned his daughter safely when she could have been lost to any number of terrible fates the city specialized in delivering. Adrian closed his eyes, took a breath that seemed to cost him everything, and when he opened them again, he'd regained some measure of control, though the control looked thin, fragile, like ice over deep water. "You brought her back," he said finally, addressing Jonah directly for the first time since the recognition. "You kept her safe when she was scared and alone. For that, just for that, thank you." The gratitude felt both genuine and grudging, offered because it had to be offered, because refusing to acknowledge what Jonah had done would violate some code Adrian held himself to, some standard of behavior that transcended personal feelings. Jonah nodded, accepting the thanks because refusing it would seem churlish, but he felt no satisfaction in it. No sense of having earned anything beyond the bare minimum acknowledgement of having done what any decent person would do. "I should go," Jonah said, and he meant it, could feel the weight of his presence in this space, could see how the people around them were watching, cataloguing, probably already constructing narratives about the homeless man and the CEO and the child who'd called a stranger grandpa with such certainty. He turned toward the doors, toward the rain and the night and the familiar territory of invisibility, but Lila's voice stopped him, high and clear and edged with distress. "No, Grandpa, don't go. You can't go." She was twisting in Adrian's arms, reaching for Jonah, and her face had crumpled into tears again. the trauma of the evening finally overwhelming whatever reserves of composure she'd been maintaining, and Adrian looked between his daughter and his father with an expression of such profound conflict that Jonah felt something in his chest twist painfully. Adrian Hargrove stood in the center of the lobby, holding his crying daughter and staring at the father he'd thought dead, and Jonah could see the war happening behind those grey eyes, could see the CEO trying to calculate the cost of every possible decision, trying to find the path that would minimize damage and maximize control in a situation that had already spiraled beyond anyone's ability to manage it cleanly. The security guards were whispering among themselves, probably debating whether they should intervene, whether they should escort Jonah out now that the child was safely returned, whether this family drama warranted their attention or their discretion. The suited woman had materialized at Adrian's elbow, speaking in low, urgent tones about police reports and statements and making sure everything was documented properly. But Adrian waved her off with a gesture that suggested he was barely holding on to his patience. Lila continued to cry, her small body shaking with the kind of sobs that came from deep in the chest, and she kept reaching toward Jonah while simultaneously clinging to her father, torn between the safety she knew and the connection she felt to this stranger who shouldn't have mattered but somehow did, and the sound of her distress filled the lobby like an alarm no one knew how to silence. "Lila, honey, you need to calm down," Adrian said, his voice gentle but strained, and he was trying to soothe her, trying to rock her the way parents did with upset children, but nothing was working, and Jonah could see the helplessness creeping into Adrian's expression. The frustration of a man used to solving problems with money and authority, confronting something that neither money nor authority could touch. "Grandpa can't stay, sweetheart. He has to go home now. You're safe, you're with me. Everything's okay." But Lila shook her head violently, her tears coming faster, and she looked at Jonah with such pleading, such desperate need, that Jonah felt his resolve crumble, despite every instinct screaming at him to leave, to get out while he still could, to not let himself get tangled in this impossible situation any further. "He doesn't have a home," Lila said through her tears, and the simple statement, delivered with a child's blunt honesty, made everyone in the lobby shift uncomfortably, made the security guards look away, made the truth of Jonah's situation impossible to ignore. "He was sleeping outside, Daddy, in the rain. We can't make him go back to that. We can't." Adrian's face did something complicated, emotions flickering across it too quickly for Jonah to pass. Shame, maybe, or recognition of an obligation he didn't want, or simple human decency fighting with years of anger and betrayal. He looked at Jonah with an expression that combined assessment and calculation, and when he spoke, his voice was tight, controlled, each word carefully measured. "How long have you been homeless?" The question was direct, almost clinical, stripped of any softness. And Jonah felt the weight of it, felt the judgment implicit in asking, in making him quantify the extent of his failure. 7 years, Jonah said, and he didn't try to soften it, didn't try to explain or justify or make it anything other than what it was, a simple accounting of how long he'd been living on streets and in shelters and under overpasses. "Before that, I was in and out of VA hospitals, trying to get clean, trying to deal with the PTSD. It didn't work. Nothing worked. Eventually, I stopped trying. Damn! The confession felt both liberating and humiliating, naming the truth in front of all these strangers, in front of the son who'd already catalogued every way Jonah had failed him, in front of the granddaughter who was too young to understand what any of it meant, but old enough to sense the heaviness in the adult conversation happening over her head. Adrian's jaw tightened, and Jonah could see him processing, could see the man trying to reconcile the father he'd known, or thought he'd known, All those years ago, with the reality standing in front of him, with this broken version of the man who'd once worn a uniform with pride, who'd come home from war with medals and nightmares in equal measure. "You're not well," Adrian said, and it wasn't a question, just a flat statement of fact delivered without emotion. "You need help, medical care, psychiatric treatment probably, substance abuse counseling if that's part of it." Each item was ticked off like a business problem to be solved, like a project requiring resources and management, and Jonah felt the distance in it. The way Adrian was trying to turn this into something he could approach with the same logic and efficiency he probably applied to running his company. "I've tried all that," Jonah said quietly. "Multiple times. The VA has programs, and some of them work for some people. They didn't work for me. Maybe I didn't want them to work. Maybe I didn't think I deserved to get better. I don't know anymore." Indeed, the admission hung in the air, and Jonah saw something flicker in Adrian's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but maybe recognition, maybe an understanding that human brokenness didn't always respond to systematic solutions, that sometimes people fell through every safety net society constructed, because the fall was the point, was what they'd chosen even if they couldn't articulate why. Leela had quieted somewhat, her sobs subsiding into hiccuping breaths, and she was watching the two men with wide, dark eyes that seemed to understand more than any 6-year-old should, that seemed to sense the enormity of what was happening, even if she couldn't name it. "Daddy, please," she said, and her voice was small, tremulous, edged with a desperation that made Adrian close his eyes briefly, made his shoulders sag in a way that suggested surrender, or at least the recognition that resistance was futile. When Adrian opened his eyes again, he looked at Jonah with an expression that was hard to read. Resignation, maybe, or duty, or simply the exhaustion of a man who'd already had the worst day of his life and no longer had the energy to fight about what happened next. "I can't let you go back out there," he said, and each word seemed to cost him something, seemed to be dragged up from some place of profound conflict. "Not tonight, not with Lila watching, knowing you're sleeping in the rain. I can't do that to her, or to myself, apparently." The last part was muttered, almost to himself, a recognition that he was making a decision based on feeling rather than logic, on the impossible demands of conscience and fatherhood, and maybe some vestigial connection to the man who'd given him life, even if he'd failed to give him anything else that mattered. Jonah felt something in his chest tighten, felt the offer land with the weight of an obligation he wasn't sure he wanted or deserved. "You don't owe me anything," he said, needing Adrian to understand that, needing there to be no confusion about the transactional nature of whatever was happening here. "I brought Lila back because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return. I don't want your charity." The words came out harder than he intended, edged with the pride that had kept him from asking for help even when he desperately needed it, the pride that had let him sleep under bridges rather than admit he couldn't manage on his own. Adrian's expression shifted into something that might have been respect, might have been understanding, might have been just the simple recognition that they were, in some fundamental way, the same person, stubborn, self-destructive, committed to suffering alone rather than accepting help that came with conditions or expectations. "This isn't charity," Adrian said, and his voice had lost some of its hardness, had become almost conversational despite the extraordinary circumstances. "This is me trying to do something that won't destroy my daughter, and dealing with the fact that apparently doing that means I have to deal with you. One night. You can stay at my place tonight, get cleaned up, get warm. Tomorrow, we figure out what happens next." The apartment on the 42nd floor existed in a different universe than the lobby below, a space so far removed from anywhere Jonah had lived in the last 7 years that stepping out of the elevator felt like crossing into a dream that would dissolve if he looked too closely at the details. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Chicago, spread out like a constellation of lights, the city transformed by height and distance into something beautiful rather than brutal, and the interior was all clean lines and expensive furniture and the kind of minimalist design that spoke of wealth so secure it didn't need to announce itself through excess. Adrian had been mostly silent on the elevator ride up, holding Lila against his chest while she'd finally drifted into exhausted sleep, her small hand still clutching a fistful of her father's shirt as if afraid he might disappear if she let go. Jonah had stood in the corner, hyper-aware of the water still dripping from his clothes, of the smell he carried with him, of the way the elevator's mirrored walls reflected back infinite versions of himself, each one a reminder that he didn't belong in spaces like this, that no amount of vertical distance could bridge the gap between who he'd become and what this apartment represented. Adrian carried Lila down a hallway, presumably to her bedroom, and Jonah was left standing in the entrance, uncertain whether he was allowed to move further into the apartment or if he should wait for permission, for instruction, for someone to tell him what the rules were, because he'd forgotten how to navigate spaces that had rules. The living room was pristine, everything in its place, magazines arranged on a coffee table with geometric precision, throw pillows positioned exactly so, and Jonah could see evidence of money and taste, but also a certain coldness, an absence of the comfortable clutter that marked a space where people actually lived rather than just existed. Through the windows, the city continued its business, oblivious to the small drama playing out in this tower, and Jonah felt the vertiginous sensation of being suspended between worlds, not quite returned to the city streets below, but not quite accepted into this realm of glass and steel and controlled climate. After several minutes, Adrian returned, and he'd changed into casual clothes, jeans and a t-shirt that somehow still managed to look expensive, and his face had settled into an expression of exhausted neutrality, all the earlier anger banked down into something colder and more sustainable. "Bathrooms down the hall, second door on the right," Adrian said, gesturing in the direction he'd come from. "Take a shower. I'll find you some clothes. They probably won't fit great, but they'll be better than what you're wearing." The offer was delivered without warmth, matter of fact, and Jonah nodded his acceptance, grateful that Adrian wasn't trying to make this into something it wasn't attempting false warmth or forced reconciliation. The bathroom was another study in expensive minimalism, all white tile and chrome fixtures and lighting that was both bright and somehow flattering, designed by someone who understood how to make even mundane spaces beautiful. Jonah caught sight of himself in the mirror above the sink and had to look away, had to confront the stranger reflected there, gaunt face, wild beard, eyes that held the particular emptiness of someone who'd stopped expecting anything good to happen. He stripped off his wet clothes slowly, each layer revealing skin mapped with old scars and new neglect. The body of a 58-year-old man who'd spent years sleeping outside and eating irregularly and treating himself with the same indifference the world had shown him. The hot water, when he finally stepped under it, felt like a form of violence, almost too intense to bear after so long with only cold showers in public restrooms or under park fountains. And he stood under the spray, letting the heat work its way into muscles that had been tensed against cold for longer than he could remember. He washed with the expensive soap Adrian kept in a dispenser built into the shower wall, scrubbing away layers of city grime and accumulated neglect, and he watched the water run grey and then brown before finally clearing. He found scissors in a drawer and spent 20 minutes cutting away the worst of his beard, then shaving with a razor that was probably worth more than any tool he'd owned in years. And gradually, the stranger in the mirror resolved into someone closer to the person he remembered being, though the eyes were still wrong, still held that emptiness that no amount of cleaning could touch. When he emerged from the bathroom wearing the towel Adrian had left for him, He found a pile of clothes folded on the bed in what must have been a guest room. Sweatpants, a t-shirt, socks. All of them too large for Jonah's frame, but clean and dry, and smelling of detergent rather than rain and sweat. He dressed slowly, his body protesting every movement, exhaustion settling into his bones now that the immediate crisis had passed and adrenaline was draining away. The guest room was spare but comfortable, decorated in the same minimalist style as the rest of the apartment, and through the window Jonah could see more of the city, more lights, more evidence of all the life happening in spaces he'd been excluded from for so long. He found Adrian in the kitchen, a space that looked like it had been designed for a magazine photo shoot rather than actual cooking, all stainless steel and marble counters and appliances that probably had more computing power than the phone Jonah had owned before he'd sold it years ago to pay for food. Adrian was heating something on the stove, soup from the smell of it, and he gestured to a stool at the kitchen island without looking at Jonah directly. "Sit, you need to eat something." It wasn't a request, wasn't even really an offer, just a statement of fact, delivered with the same efficiency Adrian probably brought to all his decisions. Jonah sat, feeling the softness of the cushioned stool, the stability of the marble counter under his hands. And when Adrian placed a bowl of soup in front of him, along with bread and butter, Jonah had to fight the impulse to eat too quickly, to devour it in the way starving people did when food suddenly became abundant. He forced himself to eat slowly, to let his stomach adjust to the richness of actual food, rather than the scraps and donations he'd become accustomed to. And Adrian sat across from him with coffee, watching in a way that felt like surveillance, like data collection. Like a scientist observing a specimen he was trying to understand but had no particular affection for. "Lila's asleep," Adrian said after several minutes of silence, broken only by the sound of Jonah's careful eating. "She'll probably have nightmares. Trauma doesn't just disappear because the crisis ends. I'll need to take her to her therapist this week, process what happened tonight." Oh, the information was delivered clinically, as if Adrian were briefing an employee rather than talking to his father. And Jonah noted the mention of a therapist, filed it away as evidence of the kind of care and resources Adrian could provide for his daughter, the kind of professional support Jonah had never thought to seek for the boy Adrian had been when he'd needed it most. "She seems like a good kid," Jonah offered, not sure what else to say. Not sure how to navigate this conversation that felt like walking through a minefield where every word could detonate some buried explosive. Smart. Sensitive. Adrian's expression flickered, something softening in it for just a moment before the control reasserted itself. "She's everything to me," he said simply. "I lost my wife 3 years ago, car accident. Since then, it's been just me and Lila. I've built an entire life around making sure she's safe, making sure she has everything she needs. And tonight she was out there alone in the rain because I got caught in a meeting and didn't notice she'd wandered away from the nanny. Do you have any idea what that's like? To realize your child was in danger and you weren't there?" The question hung between them, and Jonah felt it like an accusation even though Adrian's voice had been steady, almost conversational, stating facts rather than assigning blame. But the subtext was clear. Adrian knew exactly what it was like to be failed by a father who wasn't there, who'd chosen absence over presence, who'd prioritized his own damage over his child's needs. Jonah set down his spoon carefully, his appetite disappearing despite the half-finished bowl of soup in front of him. And he met Adrian's eyes across the kitchen island, across 30 years of accumulated disappointment and betrayal. "Yes," he said quietly, "I know exactly what that's like. I've lived with it every day since I walked out. Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about what I did to you, what I took from you by leaving. And I don't have a good answer for it. I don't have some revelation that makes it okay, or some explanation that turns cowardice into nobility. I was broken, and I didn't know how to fix it, and I made a choice that destroyed more than just myself. I'm sorry doesn't begin to cover it, but it's the only thing I have to offer." The words felt inadequate even as he spoke them, felt like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. But they were true, and truth was the only currency he had left that might have any value. Adrian sat very still, his coffee cup held between both hands, and Jonah could see him processing, could see the war between anger and something else, maybe not forgiveness, that was probably too much to hope for, but maybe a recognition that Jonah's failure had been human rather than malicious, a collapse rather than a betrayal. "The VA told me you were dead," Adrian said again, returning to that fact like it was the key to something he needed to understand. "They sent me an official letter. How does that happen? How do you just vanish so completely that the government declares you dead?" Jonah felt the question like a weight, felt the obligation to explain even though the explanation would only reveal more failure, more evidence of how thoroughly he'd abdicated every responsibility. "I stopped showing up to appointments," he said slowly, trying to remember details from a period of his life that existed mostly as fragments, as impressions, rather than coherent narrative. "Stopped checking in with my caseworker. I was using, not heavily, but enough that I wasn't reliable, wasn't keeping track of dates or obligations. I moved around a lot, different shelters, different parts of the city. At some point, they must have flagged me as missing, and after enough time with no contact, they probably assumed I'd died on the streets. It happens more often than you'd think. People disappear, and the system doesn't have the resources or the interest to track down every lost veteran." The explanation sounded hollow, even to his own ears, sounded like excuse-making, and Jonah could see Adrian's jaw tighten, could see him fighting to maintain the control he'd rebuilt after the emotional upheaval of the lobby. "So, you let me think you were dead," Adrian said, and now there was heat in his voice again, anger breaking through the careful neutrality. "You let me grieve, let me have a funeral, let me try to find some kind of closure. And all that time you were just, living under a bridge somewhere, too deep in your own misery to even consider that I might want to know you were alive." The accusation was fair, was deserved, and Jonah didn't try to defend himself against it because there was no defense, no argument that could transform what he'd done into anything other than selfishness masquerading as sacrifice. "I thought you'd be better off believing I was dead," Jonah said, and he heard how weak it sounded, how convenient. "At least then you could have closure, could move on without wondering if I might show up someday and disrupt the life you'd built. I never imagined I'd end up in a situation where we'd meet like this, where I'd be forced to confront what I'd done." Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it, just bitterness and exhaustion. "Life has a funny way of not caring what we think or imagine," he said. "You walk into my lobby holding my daughter's hand, and she calls you Grandpa, and suddenly everything I've spent 30 years trying to bury is right there in front of me, unavoidable. Do you know what that does to someone? Do you have any idea how much energy I've spent becoming someone completely different from the kid you left behind? Building this company, making this fortune, creating this life where I'm in control and nothing can touch me. And then in one moment, it all means nothing because you're standing there looking like you've been living in hell, and I'm supposed to what? Forgive you? Take care of you? Pretend the last 30 years didn't happen?" His voice had risen as he spoke, emotion finally breaking through the careful control, and Jonah saw the boy he'd known underneath the CEO's polish, saw the hurt and anger and confusion that had never really gone away, just gotten buried under layers of success and distance. "I'm not asking for anything," Jonah said, needing Adrian to understand that, needing there to be no confusion about expectations or obligations. "I didn't come here to disrupt your life or make demands or claim some kind of relationship I have no right to. I brought Lila home because she needed help. That's it. Tomorrow I'll leave and you'll never have to see me again. You can tell Lila I had to go, that Grandpa had things to take care of, and eventually she'll forget. Kids are resilient that way." But even as he said it, even as he offered Adrian the clean exit he knew the man wanted, Jonah felt something in him rebel against it, felt the loss of something he'd barely had time to recognize before it was being taken away. This glimpse of who Lila was, of who Adrian had become, of the family that had continued existing without him in ways he'd never let himself imagine. Adrian stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost thoughtful. "She won't forget," he said. "I've shown her your picture, told her stories about you from before you left, from when I was young enough to think you were a hero. She's been asking about you since she could talk, wanting to know where you were, why she couldn't meet you. And tonight she found you, or you found her, and now she thinks you're Grandpa in a way that's real and concrete, not just a story I tell. I can't take that away from her without damaging something." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications Jonah wasn't sure he understood, and he felt his throat tighten with something that might have been hope if he'd allowed himself to feel hope about anything. "What are you saying?" he asked, needing the words spelled out, needing to know exactly what Adrian was offering or threatening or simply acknowledging. Adrian ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration and exhaustion, and when he looked at Jonah, his eyes held something complicated. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but maybe a grudging recognition of reality, of the fact that sometimes life forced choices that weren't about what you wanted, but about what circumstances demanded. "I'm saying you can't disappear again," Adrian said. "Not now, not after tonight. I'm saying that as much as I want to send you away and never think about this again, I can't do that to Lila. She needs to know you're real, that you exist, that you didn't just vanish like everyone else she's lost. So we figure something out. Not father-son reconciliation, not some heartwarming reunion story, but something that lets her have a grandfather without destroying either of us in the process." Jonah felt the offer settle into his chest, felt the weight of it, and the impossibility of it, and the terrifying possibility that he might actually have a chance to be part of something again, to matter to someone in a way that wasn't just about being a problem to be managed or a cautionary tale to be avoided. "I don't know how to do that," he said honestly. "I don't know how to be a grandfather. I barely knew how to be a father, and I failed at that completely. I'm not reliable, Adrian. I'm not stable. I have issues that don't go away just because you want them to. Problems that will complicate everything if you let me into Lila's life." The confession was hard to make, required admitting limitations he usually tried to hide or minimize, but it felt necessary, felt like the only honest thing he could offer in exchange for what Adrian was proposing. Adrian nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response, as if he'd already calculated the risks and decided they were acceptable or at least manageable. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to show up, to be present when Lila needs you to be present. We'll figure out support, get you into treatment programs that actually work, find housing, deal with whatever medical or psychiatric issues need dealing with. But you have to commit to it. You have to promise me that you won't disappear again, that you won't do to Lila what you did to me." The demand was reasonable, was the bare minimum requirement for what Adrian was offering, and Jonah knew he should accept it immediately, should be grateful for the chance at redemption he absolutely didn't deserve. But he also knew himself, knew his history of starting things with good intentions and watching them collapse under the weight of his own dysfunction, and he was terrified of making a promise he might not be able to keep, of failing Lila the way he'd failed Adrian, of proving that some people were too broken to be trusted with other people's hearts. "I want to say yes," Jonah said carefully. "I want to believe I can do what you're asking, but I need you to understand the risk you're taking. I need you to go into this with your eyes open, knowing that I might fail, that I might let you down again despite my best intentions." Adrian's expression was hard to read, something between resignation and determination. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone making a decision he knew might be a mistake, but was going to make anyway. "I know the risk," he said. "I've spent 30 years living with the consequences of trusting you. But Lila deserves better than learning that her grandfather exists but chooses not to be part of her life. So we try. We set up boundaries, we have backup plans, we protect her as much as we can, but we try." The words hung in the air between them, and Jonah felt them settle into his bones like a covenant, like a responsibility he wasn't sure he was ready for, but knew he couldn't refuse. Not with Lila's face still vivid in his memory, not with the way she'd called him Grandpa with such certainty, such trust. He nodded slowly, acceptance and terror mixing in his chest, and Adrian stood, carrying his coffee cup to the sink with the kind of deliberate movement that suggested the conversation was over, the decision made, the future locked into a shape neither of them could fully predict or control. "Guest room's yours tonight," Adrian said without turning around. "Tomorrow we start figuring out what comes next. For now, get some sleep. You look like you need it." It was a dismissal, clear and final, and Jonah took it gratefully, pushing back from the island and moving toward the hallway, toward the guest room with its clean sheets and soft bed and the kind of comfort he hadn't experienced in years. But before he reached the hallway, he paused, turned back, needed to say one more thing, even though he wasn't sure Adrian wanted to hear it. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving me this chance, for not sending me away. I know I don't deserve it." Adrian finally turned to look at him, and in the kitchen's careful lighting, Jonah could see the exhaustion in his son's face, the weight of everything this day had cost him. "You're right," Adrian said, his voice flat, emotionless. "You don't deserve it, but Lila does, and right now, that's all that matters.